So, I don't believe in blind faith. As a matter of fact, I believe faith, authentic faith, begins with reason. So, Abraham departs when he was 75 years old. 75 years old, Abraham departs. He gets a promise from God at the age of 75 years old. What is with God and old age? We live in a day and time, and I'm sure most of you that are watching this are very young. We live in a day and time that is so sort of obsessed with speed, pace, get this done now. But there's something about God's timing and God and time. Remember, God runs the clock. God runs the clock. So sometimes what you and I might conveniently interpret as delay, stagnation, deflation, all of this backwardness, retrogression. It is only when you have the privilege of seeing things through God's perspective, through God's lens, that you can accurately define your current experience. There's something about God and old age, and I think that's because a lot of times it takes many of us getting to old age to yield and just give up and just know that I am spent. I have done the best I could do. And then that's when the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob comes on the scene and proves to us once again that your finishing line could be my starting point if you give me a chance. Will you give him a chance today?
Hey guys, Scripture to Culture with Jay, a book-by-book journey through the Bible where we explore the unified story of the Bible and uncover rich scripture connections that reveal how all roads in the scriptures ultimately lead to Jesus Christ. So we're in Genesis chapter 12 today, and so we're done with all the massive moments in the Bible, from the creation to the fall, to the promise, to the flood, to the covenant, and then to the creation of nations. So all of those society shifting moments are behind us now, and we're left with the story of one man and how that one man alone would rewrite the story of the world. And that man, I'm sure you know who it is. It is Abraham. Or shall we call him Abraham? Abraham to start with. So in chapter 12, verse 1, we are told that God speaks to Abraham for the very first time in his life. There's always a first time to something momentous. And this was Abraham's first experience with God. We understand that his father, Terah, worshipped idols. So if you look at Joshua chapter 24, as Joshua was beginning to give his farewell to Israel, in verse 2 of Joshua chapter 24, he references Terah, who was the father of Abraham, Nahor, and Haran, and how that they worshipped idol. And it was from that idol-reading country of Ur of the Chaldeans that God speaks to a man, an idol worshiper in Ur of the Chaldeans, and God calls him out. Now, what does God say to him? Leave your native country, your relatives, and your father's family. Leave everything that is familiar to you. Leave everything that you have seen and known all your life and move to somewhere that I will show you. That's powerful. Now, you would see that human beings naturally, we resist change. We don't like change too often. From time to time, I do some training and teaching, lecturing, and I have always pointed out to the people that I do this with that, as a matter of fact, one time I took a picture. I said to them, I am going to take a picture of you this week, and next week I would explain the reason why I took the picture to them. And I took the picture, and the following week I showed it to them. Same time, same day, previous week, now a week ahead. And they were sat in exactly the same place. Why? Because they had developed a relationship with that physical space, with that particular corner in the room. So human beings, we don't do too well with change. And this is God calling out a guy that basically God was saying, leave everything you've known. Leave everything you've known to a place that I will show you. No maps, no postcode, no P.O. box, no address, no country in mind. To a country that I will show you. So, right off the bat, we see that God is calling Abraham into faith. And it isn't blind faith, because sometimes we refer to faith as blind. No, it isn't blind faith. Blind faith, in my view, is foolishness. For an idol worshiper like Abraham to have believed God hard enough to leave everything that was familiar to him, God must have given him a reason to. We're not given the details, but Abraham was a logical, rational thinking person. He had brains which God gave him. And so for God to have convinced him to leave the familiar, there would have been a reason for him to do so. God would have showed him some things, said some things to help him understand that the gods you're familiar with are not the real gods. Otherwise, Abraham would not have left and obeyed God. So there must have been a reason. God would have proven beyond all doubt to Abraham that, hey, I am worth staking everything on. I am worth your belief. So Abraham gave his belief to God. So, I don't believe in blind faith. As a matter of fact, I believe faith, authentic faith, begins with reason. Authentic faith begins with reason. It does. Now, I am not saying that faith needs to see the entire stairway in order to take the first step. No. But faith requires reason. You must believe that this God is able. We're told in the Bible that beyond the shadow of doubt, Paul committed his life to a God that he believed was able to keep him. So the belief was grounded on reason. There was a reason for it. There was a track record. Even when we believe God for miracles, healing, whatever kind of miracle you are trusting God for, there is a reason. The reason in your case could be that God has done it before. There's a track record. The Bible is full of credible stories. So faith begins with reason. It begins with reason. And so Abraham is told to leave the familiar and the comfortable, what he'd known all his life. And God begins to give him some quite unusual promises. Don't forget, actually, let's track back. Abraham had just lost his dad, Terah. He was left with Nahor, his brother. Haran had died, but he was left with Haran's son, who was his nephew Lot. And we're told Abraham takes his wife and he takes Lot. So Lot had no father. Lot was fatherless. Abraham and Sarai were childless. So it was an imperfect family. It was an incomplete family, but they left together trusting God. Lot had become the child that Abraham didn't have. Abraham had become the father that Lot no longer had. So this was a family that was had been cobbled together. They had wounds, that were being healed mutually by the other party. And so they leave the familiar because Abraham was now about to settle. He had settled. Monday's dad's dead, settled. But now God shows up and God says, I am going to change everything. I'm going to rock the boat, and begins to give this idol worshiper a promise. Now, what happens? So Abraham departs when he was 75 years old. 75 years old, Abraham departs. He gets a promise from God at the age of 75 years old. What is with God and old age? We live in a day and time, and I'm sure most of you that are watching this are very young. We live in a day and time that is so sort of obsessed with speed, pace, get this done now. But there's something about God's timing and God and time. Remember, God runs the clock. God runs the clock. So sometimes what you and I might conveniently interpret as delay, stagnation, deflation, all of this backwardness, retrogression, it is only when you have the privilege of seeing things through God's perspective, through God's lens, that you can accurately define your current experience. There's something about God and old age, and I think that's because a lot of times it takes many of us getting to old age to yield and just give up and just know that I am spent. I have done the best I could do. And then that's when the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob comes on the scene and proves to us once again that your finishing line could be my starting point if you give me a chance. Will you give him a chance today? So at 75, I can reel off stories and stories of people who have achieved their best accomplishments just prior to their death. So Abraham is 75 when he gets the promise. He leaves, he obeys God. I know you've done great things, you've done good things all your life, but I have news for you. Your best is coming at the very end. Your best is yet to be, and your best is going to be the last. Abraham's best was at the last, at the very end. So he leaves with these three people and he goes towards the land of Canaan. So he travels through the land as far as Shechem, and he sets up his camp. He sets up his tent right beside the oak of Moreh. At this time, the area was inhabited by Canaanites. Note that. Verse 7, then the Lord appeared to Abraham and said, I will give this land to your descendants. And Abraham built an altar there and dedicated to the Lord who had appeared to him. Note the word altar. Verse 8, after that, Abraham traveled south and set up camp in the hill country with Bethel to the west and Ai to the east. There he built another altar and dedicated it to the Lord, and he worshipped the Lord. Then Abraham continued traveling through the stages towards the Negev. Now notice one thing. Abraham built tent, then he built altar. So he builds tents or camps, and then he builds altars. So tents and altars, tents and altars, tents and altars. Tent was symbolic of the fact that, hey, I am mobile for God. I am ready to uproot the moment I hear the voice of God. You know, in our country, where mortgage is everything, and
Really and truly, a mortgage locks you up for the best part of your life, for the most productive season of life. 25 years, 30 years, 35 years sometimes. Should I not get a mortgage? No, I have one. But the reality of the fact is that if you allow yourself to be locked up in a place where God is no longer calling you to be, then who knows? Who knows? Just who knows? So Abraham would always build tents. In other words, I am mobile for God. This world is not my home. That was what tents symbolized. I am mobile for God, ready to get up and go, because this world is not my home. This country is not my home. My home is the presence of God. And so you could be in Iran today where there's a war going on. As a matter of fact, it's interesting to know that Abraham and Terah were from Iran. That's where they were living. Ur of the Chaldeans. They were Iranians, so to speak. Right? So you could be in Iran today where there is ongoing war in the Straits of Hormuz and still be right in the presence of God and be safer than somebody who is supposedly in a safer country. You know, sometimes we think that jumping on flights is the most dangerous transportation mode, but it's not. As a matter of fact, aircraft are about the safest because rarely do you hear crashes. And when you hear a crash, you know, the news is bombastic, isn't it? But on a day-to-day basis you drive, there are crashes every single day, all around the world, every single day. So sometimes we think, oh, because it's out of our control, I'm not the one on the stair, there's a pilot, therefore it's so dangerous. It is dangerous, but nowhere near as dangerous as crossing the road just by your house. There are accidents every day, road accidents, right? So Abraham still was faithful enough to trust God, and he leaves. He sets up tents and altars. Tents symbolizing the world is temporary, I'm ready to pack up and go wherever God speaks. And then altars were his way of showing that God is still and always going to be accepting of sacrifice, and I am the sacrifice. God is always going to be accepting of worship, and I am that worship. My life is going to be grounded on God's purpose and agenda and on his will alone all of the time. So he had a tent to remind him, I've got to be ready to get up and go. He's got an altar to remind him, I am only interested in God's agenda. And that's why every time the altars stay, because the altars were built to last, but the tents were always temporary. The tents were to go with him everywhere. So those two experiences tethered him, brought a balance to his life. I heard somebody say that when you go to a place, be ready to spend the rest of your life there. And also, be ready to leave in 15 minutes. When you go to a place, be ready to do two things. Spend the rest of your life there, and if need be, ready to leave in 15 minutes. Yeah. Paradox, right? Yeah. It takes trust in God and skill to be able to endure the friction and the tension of those lifestyles. And that is the particular spot God is calling us to be. To experience the tension of both worlds. Paul says, I have learned how to abound, and I've also learned how to abase. We have to be skilled in managing those changes. Sometimes they could be cataclysmic. In other words, they could be within a split second, 1,000 of a millisecond. It could be sudden. Right. So, Abraham travels, and then guess what? We're told that there is a famine. I would have thought God has given the promise, life is going to be sweet, amazing. In fact, I was expecting to flip the page to the next chapter and see how that Abraham had started acquiring land, taking over, naming those nations that God had promised him. But then we're told there's a famine in the land of Canaan. And so he is forced to go down to Egypt. He's forced to go down to Egypt. And he goes down to Egypt, and as he's packed with his wife, he made an agreement with his wife to say, hey, I know you're good looking. We get to Egypt and they're going to want to kill me and take you. Please, you're my sister. Fair enough. Half truth. But this behavior that Abraham shows is so grim that it shouldn't be surprising. Remember, humanity is broken. And that is why the story, Abraham's story, is not about the faithfulness of Abraham. It's about the faithfulness of a God who never gives up on us. Abraham's story is not about how well or how good he did things. It wasn't about Abraham. It was about God. It was about the God who did not and who refused to abandon Abraham even when Abraham abandoned him. That's what the Bible is about. That's what the story is about. Don't forget, you and I are seeing things through the benefit or via the benefit of a long line of history. We've seen how God has proven faithful throughout generations, but Abraham didn't quite know that as yet. Obviously, God would have shown him enough reason and logic for him to follow in the first place, but Abraham was still taking his baby steps in his faith. So, Abraham, being a member of the broken human race, commits yet another blunder to show that God's mercies oftentimes isn't earned. It isn't deserved. It is God just choosing to be who he is. In the first place, Abraham never deserved much. He was an idol worshiper. He came from that family. Why he got chose? God knows that. So once again, God is showing us that what is shocking is not that Abraham did that. That's not what is shocking. What is shocking for me is to see a God who still works through all of the blunders of our lives, all of the wrong, horrible, bad, unwise decisions we make on a daily basis, and in his wisdom, in his mercy, in his grace, he still works through all that creatively. That's what's shocking and surprising sometimes, right? So he goes down to Egypt, and we know what happens. And obviously God visits Pharaoh and lets him know, hey, you've got to let this guy's wife go. And obviously Pharaoh calls him, rebukes him. You didn't tell me she was your wife. And he kicks him out, gives him properties and things like that. And off he goes. Despite Abraham's missteps, God was faithful. Despite his misgivings, despite his wrong decisions, he came out wealthier, more prosperous. Why? Because that's just the kind of God that called him, the kind of God that calls us and speaks to you and I. Now, Abraham was 75 when he heard this. He didn't see the promise of I'll make you a great name, a big nation, I'll give you your land, through you, I will return the blessings that were lost by your forefathers, Adam. He didn't see all that until that seed, Christ, emerged in the earth. Now, have you ever thought to yourself that there are some things God is doing in your life
that would only be realized and would only materialize in thousands of years to come, maybe hundreds, maybe tens. Maybe not in your own generation, maybe in the next generation, but yet God is still speaking with a sense of urgency, asking you to be faithful, knowing fully well that the obedience you give to God today will be the defining factor in future generations to come. Hey guys, so let's bring it to a wrap, and that's it for episode 14, Genesis chapter 12. Don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and tap the notification bell so that you'll be aware when the next episode drops. So until next time, take charge and go get the book.